Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary. Today we work on a game that truly puts into perspective how temporary life can be. Okay, it's not that deep, but before we dive into the concept, remember to leave a like if you enjoyed today's video and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Also remember to turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. Now, I wanted to create the most annoying action game imaginable that wasn't about trolling the player, and what I came up with was simple. Everything that the player uses is finite in every sense of the word. Let me explain. We're going with a side-scroller beat-em-up style approach for this game to contain and simplify the process for this experiment. The player moves around with typical top-down controls and can attack with left click. The player can also do a quick dash attack by pressing spacebar, accompanied by that classic blue trail effect. The enemies are standard in behavior with two states, move and attack. They will move towards the player and when in attack range will switch to their attack state. Then after a short cooldown will either attack again if within range or return to chasing down the player. Projectiles are also typical in behavior with some special movement properties for things like shotgun slugs or RPG rockets. Speaking of weapons, the player can obtain pistols, SMGs, shotguns, and RPGs as loot drops from defeating enemies. Other loot includes health and buffs for defense and attack damage. This loot is spawned into the world as physical objects which can be picked up by the player using E, assuming they have enough room in their inventory, that is. And before we go any further, I know this HUD is an eyesore. I wanted to make something nicer, but it was low priority to the rest of our project, most of which was spent on making all this wonderful loot temporary. Not in the sense that it'll, slowly fade out of existence like you usually see in video games. Instead, every single piece of loot has a decay rate. Yes, everything from the health packs to the buffs to the weapons and even the ammo all will expire over time. This can be kept track of in real time with objects in the player's inventory. Expiration is based on rounds, of which are 1.5 minutes long, with the first 30 seconds of each round being dedicated to the player's prep time. And the short window of reprieve allows the player to manage their loot, because there are no shortcuts here. If the player wants to use something, they need to hover over their inventory and then click the space with the item they want to use. Now, weapons are automatically equipped, but things like health kits and buffs need to be applied manually with the shift key. Buffs also only exist for the round that they are applied. Now, once that moment of reprieve has ended, zombies will begin pouring in from either sides of the screen. There are two types of enemies. In the first half of the round, simple melee-based enemies will spawn. These enemies are strictly short range and need to be really close to the player to hurt them. In the second half of the round, the game will begin spawning a projectile-based variant. And thankfully, each type is only capable of one type of attack. And as one would expect, these undead nightmares can be dealt with using weapons the player can find, or perhaps begins a round with, which is completely random. And again, these weapons are nothing out of the ordinary when it comes to behaviors, but this does pose a question. What if the player has no weapons? Well, if the player tries to attack while holding a non-weapon or has equipped an empty slot, they will do a default attack, which is to spit. Indeed, inspired by good old Frank West of Dead Rising fame, the player can do a weak spit attack to fend off the undead foes until a, hopefully, better option presents itself. And on a related note, to avoid the tedium of reloading, if the player has any ammo for that weapon that they are firing, it will automatically reload for them. And finally, if the player wants to discard any items, they can simply right-click, which will spawn an object using the same code responsible for dropping loot. And as a fun aside, this mechanic will continue to maintain properties for that piece of loot, even when not in the player's possession. For example, it will remember how much ammo is left in a gun, or how many rounds are left before it will decay. And this is honestly where a lot of the time went into this project. Creating a system that would keep track of everything in play was tough. And what's crazy is this is the toned down version. Initially, this was a lot harder, with the player needing to reload manually and keep track of every buff over the course of multiple rounds. So buffs would last longer, but would decrease in efficiency instead. But between having to manage an inventory and so much to already keep track of, it just was not fun, at all. So while this version is far more traditional of an action game in that sense, it's also far more of an enjoyable experience. I also purposely did not add an explosion effect to RPGs because of how annoying it would be to use in such limited screen space. So yeah, in general, I found this concept hilariously chaotic. This version may not be difficult, but I think a version with more polish and depth could really be fun. The inventory system probably needs work, though it does beg the question, what would be a good way to go about balancing, time between inventory management and action? And while we're at it, would you play a game where everything was finite? Or is a reliance on your favorite weapon just too much to give up? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And finally, if you enjoy what I do here, supporting me on Patreon will help me keep doing it, and also get yourself some cool exclusives, such as exclusive content and game downloads, and even early access to Dev Diary videos before they're released on YouTube. But with that said, brings us to the end of today's Dev Diary, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.